Hi, everybody. I am Steve Levitsky. I am the director of the Rockefeller Center for Latin American Studies at Harvard. Welcome to our weekly Tuesday webinar panel on Latin American politics. As always, I'm joined by my co-chair, Fran Agopian. Fran, you want to say hi?
Everyone, pleasure to be here.
I also want to thank our DRCLAS team of Pao Ibata and Jillian Scales, without whom we would be literally nowhere. And before I begin, just a couple of housekeeping points. First of all, we have English, Spanish, and Portuguese translation. So if you want to hear the presentation in a language that is more comfortable to you, just go to the interpretation button at the bottom of your screen. Again, you can hear the presentations in Spanish or in Portuguese. As always, we'll be recording today's webinar. It'll be available initially on the DRCLAS YouTube channel, and we will eventually send it to all who have registered for the event. And finally, if you've got questions for our panelists today, we would love to hear them. Send them through the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. The chat is shut down, but you can send questions at any point or comments via the Q&A panel at the bottom of your screen. We will have about a half an hour towards the end today to discuss, and Fran and I will take up as many of the questions that you send as possible, but feel free at any point during the presentation to submit a question. Okay, today's session is kind of old school. We've got a single speaker rather than a panel, and that single speaker is one of DRCLAS's esteemed visiting scholars, Santiago Anria. Santi is assistant professor of political science and Latin American studies at Dickinson College. His research focuses on social movements and political parties in Latin America. He's published very widely on both of these issues, but he's probably best known for his outstanding book, When Movements Become Parties, the Bolivian Mas in Comparative Perspective. That was published by Cambridge University Press in 2018. The book examines the origins and the evolution of movement-based parties with a focus on the Mas. And not only is it one of the most important, one of the best books published on Latin American parties in general in the last few decades, but it established Professor Anria really is the leading scholar of the Bolivian Mas and the Morales government in general in the U.S. Academy. And so I strongly recommend that book. Santi is currently working with Ken Roberts on a big comparative historical project that explores the interaction between social mobilization, processes of political polarization, and regime dynamics in Latin America. Santi and Ken are really the best scholars of Latin American left that I know, so I'm really excited to see this project unfold. And Santi's talk today will draw on that project. He'll talk for about 30 minutes, which should give us 30 to 35 minutes for discussion and Q&A. So again, send us your questions. The only downside, really, of the major downside of having Santiago speak today is that this year he's been probably the best supplier of questions in the Tuesday seminar. So without Santiago in the audience, the rest of you guys are going to have to step it up. And I'm looking at you, June. All right. Without further ado, Santiago, it's a great pleasure and an honor to have you speak.
Well, thank you so much, Steve, for the extremely generous introduction. It's a real pleasure to be here, sharing some of my research with you all. I'm going to share my screen and get started. I trust you can see it now, right? Now you can. Okay. Well, thank you so much again. And thank you, Steve. Thank you, Fran. And thanks to the Rockefeller Center for hosting this event, also for hosting me during the academic year. It's been a real home away from home. And I want to thank everybody in the office for making this event possible. I want to emphasize again that my presentation is based on a book project that I'm writing with Ken Roberts. And like Steve said, it's a project that looks at polarization processes and democracy in contemporary Latin America, but especially after the left turn. I will try to offer a synthetic view of the main arguments and the kinds of issues we're thinking about, but just keep in mind that we're at the early stages in the writing process, so questions and feedback are really especially welcome at this early stage. All right. So It really is no secret that several democratic regimes in Latin America have become increasingly polarized over the last decade. I was telling you all that it is no secret that several democratic regimes in Latin America have become polarized, with established political parties eclipsed in much of the region, the political centers collapsed in almost everywhere, and in some unlikely cases, like in Chile, established parties have been outflanked by popular mobilization on both the left and on the right, leading to highly polarized and unpredictable presidential contests, like the one we recently saw in Chile between Boric and Cast. That kind of electoral unpredictability, however, is not unique to Chile, and similar types of alignments appear to be developing in places like Colombia, for example. We also saw polarization emerging in Brazil during the left turn, where spontaneous protest movements that started on the left flank of the PT, initially as an expression of dissatisfaction within the left, were then captured by right-wing voices. And this field of grassroots right activism helped deepen existing anti-PT sentiments, and the large-scale mobilization ultimately set the stage for the PT's demise. It also opened the door to a far-right militaristic alternative like that of Bolsonaro in 2018. The political arena also polarized sharply in Bolivia, as you all know, and particularly during the waning stages of the left turn in the country, leading this time to a thin-veiled military coup in the country, following a contested electoral outcome and right-wing social mobilization. That process culminated with Evo Morales' resignation in 2019 and his replacement with an authoritarian far-right figure, someone who attempted to roll back the clock to the pre-Morales' years, and somebody who went full force against the mass, deepening a pattern of conflict and violence in the country. And today, even though the presidency is occupied by a more moderate figure, a more pragmatic figure, society is still sharply polarized around what happened during those events. And there's also elite and societal disputes around the terms of public contestation and even social inclusion. There's a clash of worldviews, so to speak. And finally, we're also seeing polarizing dynamics in countries that did not join the left turn in its early stages. Like this protest against communism in Peru might capture to some degree. And Steve rightly asked a couple of weeks ago, what on earth is going on? Good question, I think. And although Latin American politics have become highly polarized over the past decade, it really is not clear why. So in the book, we're especially interested in explaining why and how the general pattern of deepening polarization has played out differently across the region. We're interested in the general pattern and how it manifests itself in different forms. I would suggest from the get-go that we are a little bit skeptical on the claim that Latin America's current forms of polarizations are purely elite-driven or elite-initiated. And I think we need a better understanding of what's going on and the interplay between societal and elite level dynamics and in different arenas of contestation. And our work is just a modest step in that direction. Polarization, as you all know, is definitely not new in the region. It's also not unique to the region. It is only new perhaps, or more intense, or even different in character, however, when we compare it with the 80s and 90s, when parties on the left and on the right played within the rules of liberal democracy and embraced neoliberal reforms. This period of depolarization in the 80s and 90s was perhaps this period of convergence was an anomaly, perhaps, in a broader arc of Latin American history, and classic theorizing linked it to democratic stability and resilience. Authors, for example, like Pérez-Linian and Mainwaring, attributing the stability of democracy to processes of ideological moderation and depolarization. So contemporary forms of conflict, of polarized conflict, then signify a change in the political landscape from the era of convergence. And they also pose some challenges in how we think about the region's third wave of democratization, or at a minimum, they invite us to think about, they invite inquiry into the underlying causes and the possible consequences of polarization moving forward. And we propose that at least part of what's going on, and I'm careful with my words here, have been conditioned by the rise of the left turn, which was itself polarizing and marked an erosion of the Washington consensus. And they have also been conditioned by the fall of the left turn, which ended pretty badly across the board. In the book, we claim that polarization and the resulting fragmentation and disarray of party systems can be traced to the failure of left parties to meet the challenges of deepening democracy through the empowerment of popular majorities within institutions that safeguard pluralism and protect minority rights. And more concretely, our analysis focuses on the one hand on the inability of left populist parties to resist what we call the autocratic temptation to concentrate power, and on the other hand, on the failure of the more moderate social democratic parties to resist what we call here the conformist temptation, or in other words, their inability to transcend the institutional and political practices of the systems that they attempted to transform. These two types of political defects and vulnerabilities were seared in the formative and historical experiences of different lefts when they were in opposition, and they were ultimately self-limiting for the left in power, helping to produce what we think of as alternative pathways to defeat, upheaval, and to polarizing effects. And in the book, we also make clear, or we also suggest, that polarization is perhaps an inevitable, probably a necessary product of efforts to challenge socioeconomic inequalities. And so it often begins with the politicization of those inequalities, which is what the left turn actually did, activating in the process the defenses of actors more committed to protecting traditional or older hierarchies. So as a regional political trend, the left turn basically ended between 2015 and 2019. This can be contested, but this is our position. No, and this started with the defeat of left Peronists in Argentina with the election of Macri. It ended in most countries with the left weakened, politically divided, and discredited. And in the cases of Venezuela and Nicaragua, for example, taking a decidedly authoritarian turn. Polarized endings happen across the board. So there's something puzzling at the heart of our work. So while the outcome was hardly surprising in cases like Venezuela and Bolivia, where new populist lefts intentionally confronted the establishment, it was far more puzzling in countries like Venezuela, Brazil and Chile, for example, where social democratic lefts made explicit attempts to contain polarizing dynamics. And in fact, I cannot remember anyone anticipating this outcome in the early stages of the left turn when I actually started writing about this. And the expectation was that the social democratic experiences could prove to be more politically sustainable. But there's some debate about what the left turn was and what it was not. And some of our colleagues are even pretty skeptical about it as a historically significant macro level trend. And seen with some historical perspective, however, we claim that it was a significant regional trend, unprecedented in both its scope and its duration. The table here just shows that the left turn produced 32 presidential electoral victories in 11 different countries. That's between 1998 and 2015. And it also produced an impressive number of re-elections in 9 out of these 11 countries. The left turn began during a period of economic hardship, but most countries joined the trend during a period of relative economic prosperity, linked to the rise in the prices of the commodities after 2003. And the boom did not cause the left turn, but it clearly helped to reinforce it and extend the duration of it. And not surprisingly, then the collapse or the demise of the left turn coincided with the with the end of the commodity boom in 2013 and 14, a demise that took place in the midst of corruption scandals in several cases, and also generalized political attrition and frustration pretty much across the board. And with the election of Macri in Argentina, then the region returned to routine anti-incumbent voting. And that election was followed by a sequence of right-wing victories, but no real shift to the right, at least in our assessment. While alternation and volatile shifts are now commonplace, it's hard to identify generalizable trend line in the region. The trend line seems to be hardly unidirectional, and no generalizable pattern is evident. But when we do contextualize this historically, the new wave of anti-incumbency that is happening today is happening in a newly aligned left-right axis and a new left-right spectrum that shaped after the implementation of market reforms, which goes on to show that those reforms, as well as the left turn, continue to shape the politics in the region to some extent or to a significant extent. So some of this alignment, the left-right alignment, will be captured in the next figure that I'm going to share, which will show a growth in both left-right structuring and a growth in left identification over time. And I'm pointing you all to that trend, which is the red dotted line here. So the figure is constructed, it's an aggregate pattern using LAPOP data, which has a host of issues. But in addition to capturing the general ideas and the growth of left identification over time, note what's going on here, the decline of the don't know, won't say, which points in the direction of this new left-right axis. What the figure with the general pattern doesn't show is the parallel construction of electorally competitive lefts at the turn of the century in many countries that did not have one of these before, like in Argentina, for example, where the traditional Peronism and anti-Peronism cleavage eventually turned into a well-defined left-right axis. And this is a point that I can come back to later on if there's more interest. But I'm gonna try to get more directly to the arguments in the book. Now, scholars have used different binary subtypes to classify the Latin American lefts, but however categorized the notion of the two lefts were never perfect or all-inclusive categories. But there were significant parallels within the two major subgroupings, what we call here the social democratic left and the populist left. And these differences were deep and differentiated the trajectories of these lefts in power. The differences did not determine whether the left turn ended, but they did influence how the left turn ended, and also the kinds of legacies that it generated. So both the social democratic lefts and the populist lefts, we claim, in a way carried the seeds of their own downfalls. In the book, we ground our argument historically, kind of reaching back to the historical roots and of the signature defects of the left, the blind spots and vulnerabilities and where they came from. So we go deep in history to tease those out. And we look at this in the two different subsets of cases. And we try to demonstrate that these vulnerabilities derailed their stated pledges, their projects to deepen democracy. And in so doing, they set the stage for the ongoing cycles of political conflict and polarization that we see today. Specifically, as I said before, we look at the formative phases and the historical experiences that shape the profile of leftist parties and their antecedent movements, and how they gave rise to alternative conceptualizations of democracy. We call this in the book imaginaries, and we welcome feedback for our language if you consider it too postmodern or anything. But I will use these terms indistinguishably here. So one conception or one imaginary emphasized institutionalized pluralism, and the other one emphasized popular sovereignty or mass empowerment. And these different conceptions were then reinforced and reproduced by the institutional contexts under which the left parties accessed office and governed during the left term. So at times, we also note they were reinforced by opposition strategies as well. And I can walk through this with the cases later on. So although there's a path-dependent logic to our argument, we're not claiming that the polarized endings were predestined, inevitably found in the formative experiences or determined by those experiences. But our point is that the two democratic conceptions, these two big ideas, were present in all those lefts, competing for influence, such that there were contradictory tendencies at work that shaped the internal politics of these different parties. And in the book, what we do is in the case studies, and we reach back in time to explain the conditions and the general contexts that empowered one set of ideas versus the other. So I'll go over the big difference and the big picture differences that we see across our primary cases, which are Bolivia, Brazil, and Venezuela and Chile. And you know, the other broader comparisons are set up, but are yet to be written. Let's put it that way. So a comparative analysis of two social democratic cases, thinking about Brazil and Chile here, and two populist cases, Bolivia and Venezuela, reveals that both subsets of lefts not only exercise power in strikingly different institutional contexts, and this is the right side of the table, but they were also shaped by profoundly different formative experiences. And this is the left side of the table. And we think this is especially important, and I want to draw your attention to this left side in particular for a few moments. So a key issue that differentiates both lefts centers on whether or not they had emerged in opposition to military dictatorships. So the trauma of severe repression under military dictatorships in the 70s helped to forge social democratic lefts that value democracy as a form of institutionalized pluralism. Or they came to see democracy as a set of institutional arrangements designed to safeguard civil and political rights, place checks and balances on political authority, and also regulate conflict among adversaries and rivals. There's a story of political learning here for us. So generational cohorts that were exposed to military rule and that helped to reconstruct democratic institutions in the 80s and 90s, learned one of O'Donnell's maxims, like you do not mess up with democracy. Steve just said that in a class a couple of weeks ago. By contrast, populist lefts—
That was not the language I used, though.
No. Well, I edited for clarity. But by contrast, the populist lefts were forged by the social democratic, by the social and political backlash against mainstream political parties and the democratic regimes that imposed market reforms in the 1990s. And although they were formed in democratic contexts, informally democratic contexts at least, they were highly exclusionary contexts, which gave rise to a more radical conception of democracy. I'm simplifying a lot here, but this left essentially came to see democracy as a form of mass empowerment or the unbridled expression of popular sovereignty. And these two alternative democratic conceptions correspond in general terms to Dahl's classic two-dimensional conceptualization of polyarchy, which I try to illustrate here. These two dimensions, these two axes, vary somewhat independently and can theoretically be a part of a virtuous cycle, and thus make possible projects of deepening democracy, which we identify in that space at the top right of the graph. But in practice, the two dimensions are pretty hard to reconcile and often producing highly destabilizing side effects. So although the lefts that we studied pledged to deepen democracy and make advances in that direction and occupy that space, they found it difficult to jointly maximize the two democratic axes. And even though they varied considerably in their short-term polarizing dynamics and polarizing effects, over time, they both subsets unleash polarizing dynamics. So in certain respects, our comparative analysis illuminates a process of equifinality with identifiable roots in formative and historical experiences. And this is an epic table, and I will try to go as quickly as possible. It's a summary of the alternative pathways to political decay and to these polarized endings. And naturally, presenting 4 cases is a challenge. So I'm sacrificing a lot of detail here, and I'd be happy to come back to the cases in the Q&A, particularly for the case experts here that may take an issue with my interpretations. But the social democratic left in Chile and Brazil at the top enter the democratic arena seeking to transform the system, but actually the left in those cases thrive within the system by conforming to its rules and by adopting its essential logic. And so I'm able to capture governing majorities, and both parties not only reproduce the very same logics of the system, but were also remolded in their own image. So even within the subset, the conformist temptation that took different forms depending on the logic of the system in question. On the one hand, for example, the Chilean socialists reproduced a technocratic logic that was ultimately defeated by the right and then outflanked by protests on the left, later on. And the Brazilian PT reproduced a transactional rent-seeking logic that was also outflanked on the left first, opening the door to the election of a far-right option after a series of devastating corruption scandals and Dilma's impeachment. Polarization was, as I said before, less surprising in the left populist cases, and committing to fighting openly the establishment and lacking countervailing forces, the left in Bolivia and Venezuela became more prone to the exercise of constitutive powers, and to do so in ways that concentrated power in the hands of charismatic figures. So this produced a range of authoritarian distortions, and like the erosion of checks and balances, the demobilization of allies, the weakening of feedback mechanisms to correct for policy errors, and more. And these tendencies not only polarized the political arena, and even in places like Bolivia, where economic policies were not especially radical, and it culminated in democratic careening in Bolivia and in authoritarian retrenchment in Venezuela. So our comparative analysis shows that the turbulent endings of the left turn were not a product of exogenous factors alone, like changing economic conditions, but that deeper political dynamics were at work as well. And we try to draw our attention to these political dimensions, these political factors. They not only constrain the ability of the left to deepen democracy, but shape the kinds, the political arena for the kinds of perturbations that we're seeing today. Maybe a quick takeaway from all this is that if challenging the establishment was intrinsically polarizing, then becoming the establishment and reproducing the major traits of the establishment was polarizing as well. And this will take me to the question of the so-called new polarization. As I mentioned early on, polarization is hardly a new phenomenon. It looks particularly high when compared to the 90s, but far lower when compared to the ideological battles and class conflict of the 60s and 70s. What we see today is indeed high electoral volatility, the decline of center parties, the rising mobilization on the left and on the right that feeds into electoral politics, and also the radicalization of the right. And the Latin American experience does show how difficult it is to put one's finger on polarization processes, because there's different forms of polarization happening in the ideological space, in different axes of conflict. There's also institutional forms of polarization. And it also happens in different levels. There's conflict dynamics in the mass levels and in the elite levels. But ultimately, I don't think they can be treated independently. And what we're trying to do in the book is to think about how they link to one another. So it can help to set this discussion or the discussion moving forward against the historical reference point of the 80s and 90s, when the consensus for market reforms reigned supreme. And spatially, ideologically, when you look at ideological polarization, what the Washington Consensus did was to compress the space for contestation. There was a convergence that removed a host of economic and social outcomes from the sphere of public contestation and compressed the grounds for ideological dispute. In that context, depolarization was taking place, but it was heavily contingent on the weakening on the left and of organized labor. It was also largely predicated on forms of democratic rule that were highly exclusionary toward popular constituencies. And yet, since the late 1990s and early 2000s, we began to see the erosion of this consensus with the strengthening of and the shift to the left. And this was preceded in many ways by mass protests, a contestation that began with the revival of social movements and made its way into the electoral arena. And this is what the politicization of those inequalities meant. It meant a process that expanded the space of contestation on this axis. It pushed it more towards the left pole, an expansion of the range of debate over the proper balance of between states and markets. But along with this strengthening of leftist alternatives, expanding the economic axis and pushing things to the left pole, what has emerged more recently during the left turn is the parallel politicization of a different axis of conflict. And for the time being, let's call it the cultural axis. And here I'm trying to draw your attention to the vertical pole. So on the top is the more inclusive pole in support of greater social equality. The bottom is the more exclusionary pole in defense of traditional hierarchies. And what we're seeing today is polarization on these axes. At least in part as a product of dynamics of mobilization. So the mobilization for the expansion of rights by groups that press claims on issues related to gender, sexuality, multiculturalism, and the types of mobilizations that propelled an inclusionary turn in the region. And we see this polarization as a dialectic type of process. So efforts by underprivileged groups to redress social inequalities tend to generate their own opposition and backlash by the traditional defenders of social hierarchies. And this ultimately makes its way into electoral politics. We see this counter-mobilization associated with the radicalization of the right that seeks to attract mass support by making cultural appeals to religious identities, moral traditionalism, anti-immigrant sentiments, and increasingly so, strict law and order. And the growing saliency of these issues becomes a part of the new polarization for us, and at least that's what we think. And part of it is driven by bottom-up dynamics, but part of it can also be seen, as I indicate in the subtitle here, as an elite-driven dynamic. So as a solution to the conservative dilemma, which is particularly acute in a highly unequal region like Latin America. So at least there's a clear interaction between the two levels of analysis. And I'm getting towards the end, Steve. I may need 1 minute more, but not more. So beyond the ideological plane, I mentioned before quickly that polarization can also have an institutional dimension, by which we mean conflict over the rules for processing ideological differences and the terms of inclusion. And this takes me back to this two-dimensional space. It's not the nicest drawing to illustrate it, but probably it makes the point. And institutional polarization emerged perhaps more acutely in the populist cases, where populist movements claimed constitutive powers, attempted projects of mass empowerment, and also assumed hegemonic forms that clashed with the vertical pole, with the checks and balances. And this raised the stakes of contestation, aggravated social polarization, and also produced destabilizing side effects. But institutional polarization also emerged in the social democratic cases, like in Chile, where the inability to expand inclusion and mass empowerment, perhaps the excessive elitism of the system, led to protests that unsettled an existing exclusionary type of equilibrium. So here we see institutional polarization that in that case may have created a democratic opening, or at least an opportunity to get rid of an illegitimate constitution. And this will take me to the final reflections, the question of whether polarization is driven from the top or from below. And we did learn a couple of weeks ago at a terrific DRCLAS seminar that existing public opinion data is not moving in a uniformly polarizing direction. But there's an issue there between intensities and numbers that may not be captured in public opinion polls, and we may need to look more closely at the interaction between social and political actors at both mass and elite levels. So this is something we attempt to do in the book, and admittedly, we're in the very early stages of the empirical analysis. So this is, consider what I'm saying here just an illustration of the kinds of issues we're thinking about. And I want to talk just a minute about Chile. At the elite level, it was a model of pacted democracy, a democracia de los acuerdos. On the one hand, the socialists governed like neoliberal technocrats, perhaps, On the other hand, the Pinochetista UDI moved gradually to the center in response to competitive and societal pressures to capture the median voter. And there were also no dramatic shifts in public opinion. But at the mass level, society revolted against the status quo and ultimately culminating in a full-blown challenge to the social pillars of neoliberalism and the political establishment that reproduced it over time. So I find it really hard to think of this case as fundamentally elite-driven polarization. And something similar can be said about Bolivia, but I don't have time to go there. So last year, as you all know, Chileans were left choosing between Boric and Kast with some degree of negative partisanship driving outsider dynamics. And the image on the left captures perhaps some of that. The public may not be sharply divided over specific policy issues, but civic activism and settled the party system outflanked the established parties on both the left and on the right quite clearly and pushed the competitive space towards the polls. And here, to be very clear, I'm not asserting that mass polarization creates elite polarization directly, but rather that societal dynamics make it possible for elites to advance these types of polarization. I said a lot, and probably very quickly towards the end, but this is just my concluding points. Latin America's left turn changed the region. Politics have become increasingly polarized in its wake, with increasing fragmentation and party systems in disarray. In some cases, this can be traced to the failure of left parties and movements to meet the challenges of deepening democracy. And polarization as a multi-dimensional phenomenon does not always have uniform effects. So while sometimes it may lead to democratic erosion and backsliding, and therefore we should be very concerned about it, some degree of polarization can also be healthy for democracy and even help to produce democratic gains. So we need to study more the conditions that lead to one path versus the other. And that's part of our task as co-authors, but as for all of us more generally moving forward. So I will leave it here and welcome your questions and comments, which will be really, really helpful. So thank you all.
Thanks. Thanks, Santiago. I'm going to lead off with a couple of questions of my own and a couple of questions from the audience. And then Fran will that second and maybe clean up. First of all, just regarding the role of the left turn in all of this. I mean, I appreciate your effort to sort of look at how the dynamics of the last couple of decades shaped what's going on now. That makes a lot of sense. But we're seeing intense patterns of polarization in countries that largely skip left turn as well. Mexico, Colombia, and Peru come to mind. So these are also polarizing and polarizing in ways that don't jump out at me as qualitatively different than the cases you're studying. So just, it's not entirely clear why the left turn or why left government of either type is sort of necessary to explain your ultimate outcome. And related to that, and I know this is the cruelest question of all, but it comes directly from the audience. And it's that, could you please score the case of Peru? Didn't come from me, it comes from the audience. Tell us about Peru. Where does it fit in your framework? I apologize, but just being democratic here. Couple more questions. How do you respond to I'm not sure I believe this, but to my claim that the cultural axis is actually the dominant axis of polarization right now? That, yeah, the Peruvian right screams about communism, but you're actually, with a couple of exceptions, not seeing serious distributive conflict over property, and the most of the fights, most of the intensity, most of the fear has to do with social hierarchies and sometimes race, maybe class, but it's not so much about redistribution, it's more about challenging social hierarchies. If that's even partially true, you tell us, I think persuasively, that a lot of this cultural polarization is driven by this conservative dilemma that, as Ken and others have shown, the sort of liberal right really failed pretty dramatically electorally in political terms in the 1990s, early 2000s. They've been either right parties have sort of reoriented, or they've been displaced by illiberal rights that are clearly appealing on this cultural axis. So, but that is an elite-driven explanation. So, if it's mainly the cultural axis, if the right is driving a lot of polarization, maybe Chile and Bolivia are exceptions, and this is primarily an elite-driven process. Finally, a question from June, who did step up and ask a couple of questions. Her first one has to do with the role, the sort of mediating role of partisan fragmentation, which has gotten extreme in almost every one of our cases, and has various effects on polarization. Sometimes it sort of artificially creates polarization in the sense that you have 18 candidates, like in Peru, and the ideological extremes are more likely to make it to the second round. There's a little bit of this in Colombia, but you're also seeing left parties forced to cobble together odd coalitions, given this fragmentation. So what's the role of partisan fragmentation and party weakness in explaining polarization outcomes? I know that's a lot.
It is a lot, but let's see how far we can get here. So there's questions about the role of the left, how would you score Peru, whether the cultural axis is the dominant, and whether this is all elite driven, and the question of partisan fragmentation. I'll go in that order. So it's interestingly enough, you raised the issue of why are you seeing similar degrees of polarization in countries like Mexico and Peru, and that did not experience the left turn to begin with. And that's probably what I could say. It's they're clearly joining, or they can be seen as joining the left turn belatedly. So that's probably part of the story. There's a competing view. People are seeing this as a second left turn. Our position is closer than these other countries that joined it belatedly. And what you see is the kinds of repoliticization that we saw earlier on in the region in other cases. So kind of, and which, as I said before, so the turn of the left was itself polarizing. So what we're seeing is just this unfolding in later on. It's equally interesting to me, just to add there, that perhaps we see the polarized conflict with more intensity in cases that did not experience a shift to the left to begin with, and in the social democratic cases. So this is something that we do not have fully resolved in our story, but it's there, and I'll be happy to talk about the other cases that perhaps that managed to avoid polarizing dynamics will be a good contrast to this. But so interestingly, the social democratic cases and those that did not shift to the left in the early initial phases are now seeing this kind of intensified conflict. So maybe there's a story there that doesn't have to do directly with the left turn and the ending that I mentioned before. So it's not necessarily the end of the left turn. So in the cases of Peru and Mexico, but the similar kinds of politicization that we saw early on in the 2000s. But it's not something that we address directly. I try to be cautious with the framing that we're not trying to explain all the polarization in the region and everything we see. So this is kind of in a way limited to the cases we studied that experience a left turn. So so far, very preliminary responses. Then where Peru, where does it fit? How would you score it? In terms of polarization, what types of polarizing dynamics you get, whether it's institutional, ideological. I don't know if the question went in that direction, but we do see some interesting dynamics happening at the elite level in a highly fragmented context, but also some of the polarizing dynamics at the grassroots. which I think many people are kind of ignoring because they're small size. But the kind of grassroots organization and protests on the right are shaping up in ways that are reminiscent to other cases in the region. I don't know how to score it directly because I don't know enough about the case, but I do see some organizing on the right that is particularly concerning. In terms of the cultural axis and whether it's the dominant, not sure if I could say that it is the dominant, but it definitely is one that features kind of quite prominently, and that's the issue that we identified as a new dimension, perhaps, or one that got amplified in over the past decade or so. And yes, you're right that the story, as I told it, and it was just to put into question that all the polarization we're seeing in the region is fundamentally elite-driven. But there is significant elite-driven polarization, and as I said, this attempt to resolve and to figure out a way to solve the conservative dilemma is definitely driving some of these polarizing dynamics, with political parties on the right unable to draw on existing on declining clientelist networks, unable to persuade lower class voters that market policies are the way to support them. So this is a relatively straightforward way to move and try to gain majorities for parties on conservative parties. So whether Chile and Bolivia are exceptions, I'm not totally sure. And I'm not totally convinced yet that let's say Brazil doesn't fit into the Chilean story as well. There's clearly elite-driven dynamics there, but there's also a significant degree of right-wing organizing from below that fits into this dynamic. So I find it hard to just look at one versus the other and without seeing the interaction. So the June protests that started in 2013 in Brazil, for example. And so when the polarization started, really, wasn't necessarily at the elite level and parties kind of organizing this, deploying culture wars, or these mass dynamics kind of provided the opportunity to deploy that strategy. So in terms of June and the degree of partisan fragmentation, I think it does. It's central to the story. We don't have a good theoretical explanation for this, the role of fragmentation, but I would imagine that the greater degree of fragmentation is kind of ripe for this type of elite driven forms of polarization. Kind of the more fragments, the greater the incentives to deploy these types of top-down polarization. So I do think it plays a role, and it's true that in addition to the fragmentation and in the preferences of the electorate, the party systems and partisan attachments are particularly remarkably low. So I do think it's it's a question of I don't have a good theory about this. It's the more fragments, the more likely you'll get this, but it definitely. I could lean in that direction, perhaps.
Okay, turn to Fran, who has promised not to ask about Peru.
Please don't.
Well, and the job of the number 2 hitter is to just advance the runner. So we're just going to advance the conversation here. I'm not going to take it in a whole new direction. So there's a series of questions, Santi. Thank you. First of all, this was a magnificent presentation. So there's a series of questions from the audience about what we should make out of the failure of democratic deepening. Mm-hmm. We have a question about whether you would be suggesting that non-leftist failures to deepen democracy would lead to less societal polarization. Mm-hmm. Is that a lesson we could take away? And a second question. Fernando Bizarro asks, how would the failure to address demand for democratic deepening translate into polarization? What is the mechanism? And Ben Bradlow asked a related question about why you would see the failure, why you would see the shortcoming of left parties to deepen democracy is a failure, when it seems, if you look at Chile, that the failure might provide the basis for a further deepening after a right turn. That this could be like how you could see the left resurgence in Chile. So how should we think about this? And a somewhat related question, Dorothy Kronig asks, that there's a quality of a damned if you do, damned if you don't temptation to conflict and polarization. And like, what are you supposed to do here? Under what conditions can the left be successful?
Yeah.
That's sort of a package of questions about this very important argument that you made about the democratic deepening. I now want to just sort of ask a question. Well, Fernando's second question, which I'm going to dress up also, sort of because it's a question that I have too, and that is, I was looking at your 2x2s in the cases, and I was trying to think about how I would map that 2x2 onto some of your other, what could be seen as 2x2s, even though you didn't present them that way. You presented them as like sort of just the XY axes, but we could think about them and how I would map them on. So speaking for Fernando asks, sort of is wondering about how you see Brazil and Bolsonaro as a response to the failure of democratic deepening, that, maybe you could see this in Chile, but like, how do you see this? So maybe you sort of started to talk about this, but in looking at the Chile and Brazil cases, and I was looking at the 2x2, I was, this is your fault for putting Dahl right after this 2x2. So if I were going to put these cases on Dahl's 2x2, I would have not put Chile and Brazil in the same quadrant. I would have put Chile in even though there's universal suffrage in Chile since 1970, once it came back. But I mean, since the literates got the vote, there's universal suffrage. But if we think about political participation more broadly, as a lot of young people in Latin America and elsewhere in the world do today, I would have put Chile on the left-hand side of Dahl's quadrant, but in the upper left-hand corner. I would say it was a case of free contestation, but in terms of who could participate in the business of government, who could participate, who could weigh in on what kind of policies would actually be implemented, I would put Chile over there. I would put Brazil farther to the right. I would say that Brazil became a broadly inclusive democracy over time, with lots of socioeconomic reforms that were within the bounds of fiscal responsibility, but which created citizens out of former clients among tens of millions of people. And that, in that sense, I don't see protest as having driven, I mean, if anything, the left in Brazil moved farther to the moderate side of the of your spatial XY axis. And it wasn't popular protests that drove them there. So I'm just wondering how I'm supposed to wrap my head around like how we see this relationship between whether or not a party system had collapsed, how inclusive it was. I mean, I think I could, toss out a couple of things about Bolivia, not about Venezuela, about which I know embarrassingly little. But I think that the point is made, and I'll just stop and give you a chance to talk. So to wrap up, what about, what is this role of failure of democratic deepening? What are we supposed to take away from this? And then using the cases to ask a broader question about how we're supposed to understand the relationship between what this 2x2 is giving us when we think about what happens afterward and how we're supposed to map participation and contestation.
Yes. Well, thank you, Fran. These are great questions. And I'm especially happy to see the round of questions coming from scholars that I respect so dearly, like Fernando, Ben, and Dorothy. The question I'm going to try. I'll address them in that order because I think they follow some sort of sequence. The issue of the failure of democratic deepening and the mechanism directly. So first, some reflections on the notion of deepening democracy that I could only explain very briefly there, but the notion of how to reconcile and mutually reinforce both axes is a central dilemma for the left in Latin America. And surely you can think about a highly inclusive democratic order that empowers majorities, reduces inequalities, while still respecting the checks and balances. And that, Fran, is perhaps the story of Brazil as you are telling it, and it's the way you tell it in your Journal of Democracy piece. So the 2016 piece. And so that's how I understood your depiction of the case and your comment just now. So there's, and I'll come back to the case specifically, but so this theoretically it's possible to reconcile, mutually reinforce these two, but and particularly in the short run. But the synergistic kind of reinforcements and tensions and trade-offs are more the norm than the rule. As in the mechanisms that we identify perhaps in the cases that you would have expected this two dimensions to reconcile more easily, the social democratic cases, I think they both and this is probably, there can be a disagreement of how we map out the cases here from, but in both, what happened is that there were the inability of let's say social movements that propelled these forces to power to be effectively represented through a left party in power, just kind of generated defections, exits, protests. The protests in Brazil, as I understand them, started in 2013 on the left of the PT and not necessarily on the right, and similar in dynamics. So they started on the left flank of the party. So one of the mechanisms that we see is this defections from allies, which they tend to intensify the degree of, once your allies leave you and protest against you, then any other challenge of frustration and anger kind of seems intensified or magnified. And that's probably across the board in both cases. Going to the issue of a failure, Ben's, it's a provocative question. Because, well, if you consider the inability of the Chilean left to deepen democracy as created an opening for a new phase of deepening democracy. So where is the failure? Was it a failure or was it just an enabling condition? And the question of failure keeps coming up, and I don't have a good response to how would you define failure if you look at the broader kind of longer arc here. But I could say that still the Chilean case found it particularly harder to reconcile both. So it's in a way a much more extreme case, and here I agree with Fran. The question of under what conditions you can be successful, so that Dorothy threw into the discussion. It does seem that, well, no matter what you do, there's this deep temptations and derailing these projects, and there's not an easy solution to this. And well, clearly then you get here other dimensions that I didn't even talk about. So it's not only the temptations and the ideas that emerge in the formative experiences, but then you have the institutional context, and real constraints. So we don't want to claim that they had it that easy, right? And that they messed up, and the lefts across the board, that that failure was so predestined. So the institutional context wielded, great significant, countervailing effects in the social democratic cases. Also the strategies of opposition. This is something that Dorothy knows especially well. It's harder to harmonize the two axes, when you have an intransigent, opposition, and also the shifting economic circumstances, and so on. But at the end, we do not solve the full equation under what conditions you can make this, these two axes, produce synergies. We don't have a theory of what produces it, right? But we're interested in identifying the roots that made it significantly hard in the region. The issue that the last point, Fran, so I agree that they will not be probably mapped exactly on the same exact same space in Brazil and Chile. But there's an issue maybe worth thinking about, what type of inclusion and participation we got, in both of these instances. I agree with you that Brazil constructed a far more participatory and inclusive democracy than Chile. There was also the parallel story of the organizational evolution of the party, of the PT, and how it, gradually sidelined the very same movements that propelled the PT to power, and grew increasingly detached from these groups, or at least as constitutive members of the governing coalition. So in a way, this is a long way to say that maybe it's a question of the metrics we're using here, how we talk about inclusion. The way we're thinking about it is, not just the generalized expansion of opportunities for participation at the local level, the multiplicity of participatory institutions, but we're looking at allied actors forming a constitutive part of the governing coalition. And in that sense, I think the story of the socialists and the PT becomes a little bit more similar, despite the differences in the proliferation of institutions, the concrete attempts at making democracies more participatory. So I still think that, seeing the cases comparatively, they may not map neatly right next to each other, but in generally they're part of the same kind of subset. But we can continue the discussion on this.
Okay, Santiago, I want to do a deep dive now into the case of the splinter parties in the Peruvian left. No, I'm kidding. A few more questions from the audience. First, Caitlin has a question about international transnational forces. Your story is really entirely domestic.
Yep.
But particularly, I would say, when you look at the cultural axis, it's pretty easy to identify potential transnational ideas and transnational actors that are influencing both the sort of cultural left and the cultural right. What, in your view, is the role of international transnational forces in this story? Secondly, a question from Ken, which is actually a couple of questions on the center and on political moderates. So Ken asks a simple but really difficult question of why it's been so difficult for the political center to mobilize and present viable electoral alternatives, particularly in cases where the bulk of the electorate is clustered broadly in the center, where the electorate is not terribly polarized. Why is it so hard for the center to present viable alternatives? A related question, sort of a different spin on that question, comes from Sebastian, who argues that if in fact polarization is concentrated in politicized minorities, which is the case in most cases, theoretically at least, moderates should be decisive electorally. Is that the case? If not, why not? What is the role of moderates in sort of determining outcomes in this polarized context? And finally, Fernando pushes back. He wasn't going to let you have the last word. And he claims that, or points out that Chile and Brazil have both undergone quite a bit of democratic deepening in recent decades. Argentina, by contrast, has, in his language, stagnated. I would push back a little bit and point out that Argentina started out considerably more democratic than both Chile and Brazil 25 years ago. So let's not overstate this. But the question is, if that's the case, if Brazil and Chile did experience a considerable amount of democratic deepening and Argentina really didn't, shouldn't we see extraordinary levels of polarization in Argentina?
All right. Fernando is on fire. Everyone, no, thank you for the questions. Caitlin asked about the transnational forces, and frankly, I do not have a good story here to tell. Clearly, the Trump effect may have played a role, and we see at least some moderate correlation between the mobilization of these grassroots right-wing groups, and the strengthening of this new rights in the region. But I don't have a good story that connects in the two, to be honest. And that's not something that we have yet studied at all in the project. But I do welcome it as an idea of something we need to pay more attention to. That's for sure. Several of now thinking quickly the grassroots organizing that I'm thinking about. Several preceded the rise of Trump-like figures. So then there's, they just kind of didn't start at that moment, but their mobilization clearly intensified with those kinds of and transnational forces at work. The one thing that we pay more attention to is the change in economic circumstances as an exogenous condition. We have a better story there, but definitely. And we can include more of this other story. Ken, let's talk about this later. I do not have a really great story.
No, man, I want to hear. I want the answer.
Well, yeah, well, he declined to participate today. So, that I think the explanation will vary quite significantly. I mean, the significantly harder for the center to articulate a viable alternative in countries like Bolivia, where and Venezuela perhaps, but there was a clear intentional attempt at dismantling those forces, so it took a while for the center in Bolivia to reconfigure. In a way, and probably the decline had to do with the chronic or severe difficulties, and also concrete state level action to make it difficult, right? So I think there the degree of institutionalized competition was different across the cases. The Chilean case, I wish you could tell us now, Ken. I do not know the story there very well, but that's a question to think about. Far more probably the follow-up question to this would be, and this is again one that I do not have fully resolved in my thinking, is what are the incentives for moderates? Why do they push to the extremes, or why do they find it easier to go to the extremes rather to stay more grounded on the center? And again, this probably goes back to the question of fragmentation that Steve raised a few moments ago. Sebastian, the role of minorities as voting blocks, if I understood the question correct. So if the new polarization is happening on this cultural axis.
No, moderates. Not
The
minorities.
moderates.
Moderates. The role of moderates.
So
Shouldn't they should be pretty powerful. Why are they or are they not? Electoral moderates.
So the electoral moderates, well, this is again the question of intensities and numbers and the. I think it's probably important for making sense of some of this, and this is, you know, who is actually able. And this, we're thinking about this with Ken. So when you look at public opinion data, yes, there's, you know, bunch of people are presented with, you know, a scale and significant portions, you know, identify with a 5 or a 6 or whatever number they're presented in the scale. But the question here, you know, who can actually translate those preferences into viable electoral alternatives and generate some sort of political mobilization, whether it's in the streets or in the electoral arena. So probably a lot of what the public opinions may be capturing or they may not be capturing widespread polarization of citizens responding to surveys, but then when it comes down to who can shape the political arena, translate frustration into some sort of mobilization strategy. So who actually gets to shape the arena? And I'm not terribly persuaded that it's the moderates. So maybe there's something like that going on. This is probably a side story with this would be, and again, something that I have to think about far more is you know, we're in a context of, you know, mainstream political parties weakened, economies pretty much, you know, in shambles, anti-incumbency happening, and the general trend is, you know, weak partisan attachments across the region. So maybe, I don't know the moderates, but there seems to be like negative partisanship becoming stronger in the region and opposition to the other side. And that seems to be playing an outsized role in shaping the electoral arena more than the centrists. So there, but again, things I need to think about, you know, far more. And Fernando, this is you know, I do agree with you that so that both Chile, I hope I didn't make the point, and probably I did, so I'm correcting it at the very end, that it's not that Brazil and Chile did, you know, zero improvements or movement toward a project of deepening democracy. The question of Argentina, you know, so if there was comparatively less democratic deepening, it probably does have to do with the baseline and where these two are starting. But I think your intuition is also something I would agree with. I would expect to see significantly more degrees of polarization. Not to say that it's not there. Probably a little bit more contained due to the ability of the, you know, left party to retain stronger connections to those movements that stayed out of the you know, partisan coalitions in Chile and Brazil. So probably there's something about the party societal ties and that remain stronger in the context of Argentina, despite the lack of real kind of you know, move towards a project of deepening democracy. So the really interesting additional comparison there would be to include Uruguay in the story as a case that made significantly more clear strides towards that and prevented the kind of polarizing dynamics we're seeing elsewhere. But what Uruguay may have, you know, the point of the strong party society ties, it would play, you know, quite an interesting role there. And maybe some of that is going on in Argentina, although now that I think about it, there were decisions and fractures, but probably the Frente de Todo managed to keep together a broader array of popular movements around it that didn't kind of go out and challenge or outflanked the Frente Amplio on the left, right? Which that sets it apart. But imperfect answers to your questions, but they're definitely good ones to consider.
Okay, Santiago, I thought your answer on the moderates question, the role of negative partisanship is probably right on. That makes a lot of sense. What's interesting is, unlike the United States, where the concept of negative partisanship emerged in the context of strong, solid, stable, intense partisan identities, this is often happening in a context of really weak. You get negative partisanship in a context of very weak partisan identities.
Yeah.
A couple of, and I also need to point out that Argentina, according to last year's Freedom House rankings, was more democratic than the United States. Also true of VDEM's electoral democracy score, more democratic than the United States. Same cannot be said of Brazil. We need to close. There were a couple of questions that came in at the end. I apologize that we did not get to you, but one of us has to run off to class. Before thanking Santiago, I just want to announce that next week is spring break. But after that, on March 23rd, we'll have Janice Gallagher speaking. The talk is entitled Bootstrap Justice, The Search for Mexico's Disappeared. And we'll have commentary by our own Caitlin Criswell, who is terrific. So thank you everybody for coming, and thanks in particular to Santiago Anria for a really, really terrific presentation and a very provocative discussion. Thanks so much. I look forward to this book. Take care, everybody.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you so much.